Before I get started too far, I just want to point out my email address, which is the best way to get a hold of me. If you need copies of protocols or copies of spreadsheets, anything that might help you all be able to look at your IHC to improve or compare or make any changes, I am very, very, very happy to share whatever I can with anybody. This is all about patient care, and so just make a note of my email address and just put on there webinar, Sakura webinar, something so that it doesn't get stopped in our firewall here at Norton Healthcare CPA Lab. I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you all, and this is a little bit about the history, my history and experience with IHC, very briefly, and let you know that we always take into consideration the CAP and CLIA rules, and then what we do at CPA, the lab I work for, and we'll have a little bit of discussion. And if you have questions, feel free to email me if you don't go online. But I want to thank you again for taking part in this webinar. The objectives you have read, so I'm going to pass over those. Let's start out by talking about new antibodies and lot-to-lot validations, repeat testing, equipment. Testing has to be done biannually, especially if you have multiple instruments. There's ways to test to make sure that your instruments are performing optimally. All of these things are very, very important. When the equipment is brand new, it needs to be tested, and if you have a PM done or major repairs, it also needs to be tested to make sure that it's functioning optimally at all times. Just a little bit about my history. I was introduced to immunohistochemistry in 1976, and I had always had a fascination and a love for special stains. And when this new thing, immunohistochemistry, immunoperoxidase, came on board, I had a hard time pronouncing the word, much less knowing anything about it, and I found it to be quite a mystery to use colorless reagents until you all through a whole process, and finally at the very end expose the tissue to diamidobenzidine and have color. So I had a fascination and a love for immunohistochemistry from my very introduction. Way back when we would stain hundreds and thousands of slides because we had to know there was nothing automated, there was nothing that you could buy ready to use, not even DAB. You had to weigh out your DAB powder and mix it in a diluent and then add a couple of drops of hydrogen peroxide right before use to be able to get it to stain. But back then we had to dilute each step of the way and use what is called cross checkerboard titrations. And with this, we had thousands of slides sometime to be able to look at and see the entity that we were staining. Now, I'm not going to just read the slides. I'm going to just talk about what we do and how we do it, because you all can have the slides to read at your leisure. But after a few years, CAP became involved and other regulatory agencies. And the reason that we want to do everything by these agencies is the agencies are here to protect the well-being of the patient. They want to make sure that the patient gets an accurate diagnosis so that patient can have the most optimal treatment available. And we always have to remember this could be our mother, our father, our child, our brother, or our sister. And this really hits home when it is a member of your family and you want that immunohistochemistry to be the best it can be. Some of the considerations in today's world of immunohistochemistry are the pre-analytic, the analytic, and the post-analytic. The pre-analytic starts out with warm ischemia. Warm ischemia is when you start snipping that very, very first blood vessel. You know, we learn in histology in our very, very beginning that autolysis starts. You start snipping those blood vessels, it is changing the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins. And most of our immunohistochemistry, we are staining and looking at proteins. If you're doing in situ hybridization, you're most likely looking at RNA, be it messenger RNA, other RNAs, you're looking at DNA. So we have to always keep these pre-analytic conditions in mind at whatever we do and when we're troubleshooting what we are already doing. Another thing is the cold ischemia. For breast specimens and certain specimens, we do document the cold ischemia time. And if you're going to report out estrogen and progesterone receptors, this is very, very critical. We have to look at fixation, and this is pre-analytic, your specimen ID, your labeling, your processing, and your sectioning, and your storage of the specimen. How you store that is very important. The analytical is what affects us all too, and this is the optimization of antibodies. What pretreatment are we going to use? Are we going to use an enzyme? Are we going to use a heat retrieval such as EDTA or citrate buffer? And there are many other retrievals that can be used, especially in research. We need to look at the dilutions and our detection systems. We need to look at the sensitivity and the specificity. And also analytic comes under the tech training and the instrumentation, and how well are we maintaining that instrumentation. The post-analytic is really a lot with the pathologist. They look at the controls, they look at the they make the interpretation. They are responsible for reporting, but a lot of times the reporting does get verified by histotechs and other technical people. And this is sort of from our pathologist standpoint. They feel like that the post-analytical is a pathologist's performance, you might say. We are on need for antibody validation. We have experienced staff here that watches daily for variances in staining. If you take a slide off of the stainer and you know that slide should be very, very dark in color with brown or very, very red just on the tissue, and you notice that there's no staining there, that needs immediate attention. We have people who watch for this all the time. The techs are trained. They know to watch for variances in staining. The pathologists also are very, very wise to watching for any fluctuations. And these fluctuations should not be ignored, because it could be something's wrong with the instrument, something's wrong with your reagent. When you make changes in the protocol, for a particular case, you must dictate this in the report. And this could be a decal specimen, a frozen section, a cytology specimen. Things like that do need to be dictated in the report. And these are CAP requirements as well. Now, what do we do as a histotech or an immunotech when the pathologist requests a new antibody? We want to ask questions. And it depends on how you communicate with your people, what your responses can be. If you let them know this is for your information, you want to know as much as you can about it, most pathologists are very, very helpful. I like to also use the vendor's information. I like to use Google. And I don't stay with particular vendors. I like to get a general idea of what's out there, what antibodies might be the best. And we are so fortunate in today's world that even Google, you can find pictures of what your results ought to look like. How should the staining appear? And then you also may see trends, and especially if you've been doing immunohistochemistry for a number of years, you'll see where this particular year, an antibody is the big time favorite, and all of a sudden you see it not so important, but a better antibody has come along to replace that. So we always have to do research, and research the antibody, research and development in a sense. And you want to, when these antibodies change like this, you want to look into get as much information as you can prior to your purchase. You want to look at it once you get it in-house. You want to look at everything you can look at, read all of the information you can prior to trying to validate this. Become familiar with the staining pattern. Look at what the staining is going to look like in normal tissue and in tumors. Sometimes that can be vastly different. The real test will come after you start testing the antibody. You want to be familiar. Is this stain a nuclear stain? Is this a cytoplasmic stain? Some things actually will be nuclear and cytoplasmic. If it's nuclear, will the DNA or the RNA stain? Will the RNA not stain? You really need to know that. And is this a surface membrane or a chicken wire pattern stain that you're looking for? Now, things that we need to always remember and consider is, what is your fixation? What is the temperature? If you have heat available on your stainer, or you prefer to use heat, what is that room temperature versus warmer temperatures going to do? What about your incubation times? What is the titer? What is the diluent? All antibodies are not happy in the same diluent. This is one of the nice things that in today's world we have access to so many ready-to-use antibodies, and the manufacturers many times know what diluent keeps that antibody happy. And then when you're working up new antibodies, and even working with antibodies you've had on hand, such as BCL1, you want to use a positive and a negative control. And I'll show an example later on in this webinar of a positive and negative control. Now, what does pretreatment do? The pretreatment unmasks the epitopes that we have masked with formalin fixation. Like I mentioned a little while ago, you may want to use a citrate buffer with a pH of 6, an EDTA buffer with a pH of 9, or an enzyme. It is really recommended with most antibodies, if your spec sheet says to use, say, citrate, you also try a slide from the same block with an enzyme and a slide with it cut from the same block with an EDTA. Sometimes in your methodology, in your laboratory, conditions are different, and you will get the best results using something else. If you're using an automated system where your retrieval, your dewaxing, everything is online, you're going to get less fluctuation of temperatures and probably faster staining possibilities. But if I have used in the past pressure cookers, decloakers, PTMs, when you validate these properly, they all work exceptionally well. They do have to be validated, whatever you're doing. You also need to look at what category are you looking at. Is this a predictive marker? The CAP has a lot more guidelines for predictive markers such as your ER, your PR, your HER2/neu than they do for some of the others. And you want to know, because with something like the microsatellite instability, the MSI, you have to have positive controls, meaning the MSI will stain on your control, but with an MSI, a true diagnosis of positive means there's a deletion of the microsatellite instability. So when you see the patient is positive on the slide, it really means they do not have the disease. A negative on the slide means they do have the disease. There are certain brain tumors that we work with here that are the same way. If the brain tumor expresses this particular antigen, that means they are negative for that antigen. If now I like to start out by pulling controls that I already have in-house when that is possible. Sometimes we make small MTAs, and sometimes we use normal tissue and abnormal tissue or tumor tissue. You can purchase a lot of MTA slides. There are several companies who make those. The pathologists also need to get used to looking at how things stain in abnormal and normal tissues. So keep that in mind, that when you're introducing them to a brand new antibody that they requested, they may need to familiarize themselves with what looks the best too. Now here we have over 220 primaries, and we also have probe FITC with a system, the DAB system and the ALK-Phos. And just remember that whatever you use in your lab, when you get these antibodies in, when you get your probes in, when you get your FITC, which is a link in, when you get your system in, they all must be parallel tested. I refer to this very often as lot-to-lot or shipment-to-shipment testing, because if you get, say you order 5 vials of CD45, and you get 1 in on Monday, 1 in on Tuesday, 1 in on Wednesday, 1 in on Thursday, and 1 in on Friday, and the lot numbers are all the same, that means each day that you receive one, you must parallel test that particular one. The reason is you don't know what happened to that in shipment. It could have frozen, it could have overheated, you could have received a vial that is empty. There's no perfect anything, except we have to make sure that what we test for, and we try to find any type of issues that could happen prior to it being used on a patient. When we get a new antibody, you want to always read the spec sheet very, very carefully and read the parts about what will normally stain and what will not, what abnormal tissues will stain. You may have an assortment of tissues in-house that can help you with this. I know infectious tissue might be a little bit different. You may have to do a query to find your positive cases, but you want to stain an assortment of regular controls if you have that available. If not, do a research study and find where you can get these cases from, usually from cases that have been signed out or maybe sent out for a second review to that would be positive. Any of this work you want to document. CAP and CLIA both want to see documentations, and sometimes I feel like I'm not going to be able to get in my office because of all the paperwork, and I'm very happy for this to be moving to electronic, so I will be able to get in my office. When you have the positive tissue, you want to work out all of your optimal conditions, what pretreatment works. You want to work out the titers, and what system. Does this show up better with the DAB HRP, or is it better with ALK-Phos red? And this is just a short example of when we set up glycopan 3. In order to set up a new antibody, we like to compare. Sometimes CAP says right now 10 positive and 10 negative if it's non-prognostic. However, because the pathologists are getting used to this, it might take 2 cases, they're used to it, but most of the time it will go over the limit that CAP expects. But however you do this, you want to make sure that you have documentation to show when CAP comes in. And this is an example of placenta stained with glycopan 3. It does serve as a very good control, and you can see a lot of very positive staining. This appendix is used as a negative control, and the only thing you see here is blush. And if you look at the benign areas that show a blush and the hepatocyte tumors, you can see the positive tumor with the glycopan 3. Now, when you're optimizing a new antibody, you want to look at your fixation. Most of the time we work with formalin-fixed paraffin-embedded tissues. We want to make sure that we DWAC and pre-treat. You want to try several pretreatments on some of the antibodies. Not everything, but it's better if you have a baseline. You know what works better with EDTA, what works better with citrate. If you're buying a concentrate, generally I start with a recommended titer and then move up one and run it, and then sometimes we have to go higher and higher because the system that we use is very, very sensitive. You also want to look at endogenous peroxidase quenching, and then you want to look at your system and also a nuclear stain, and this is I always call the H&E a roadmap, but you want to see the nuclei to give the pathologist details of what they're looking at, and documentation. Always documentation. If you're buying your ready to use, you also want to work out the optimal conditions. The incubation time of antibodies can vary. We have a few. Some are ready to use, some are concentrate, but we may have to increase the timing on the primary antibody and document any change. If you're getting a new antibody introduced into the lab, a new clone, a new system, a different pretreatment, any change, shipment to shipment, lot to lot. CAP wants to see documentation. The RTUs, we order, a lot of them come in reagent vials. When a new shipment arrives, I like to have on that same day, the same package, write down the lot numbers. Sometimes what's on your invoice might be different than what you actually get. And you want to make sure that if you order, say, 4 CD30s, all 4 of those have the same lot number, because sometimes you can have 2 or 3 lot numbers. But you want to be aware of that. Each one of those lot numbers has to be tested for lot to lot. If you're getting a concentrate, you can check the protein concentration of the old concentrate that you had. You want to check the protein concentration of the new item on your shelf. And then generally, if they are very, very close or similar, you can test this in a titer tube and make sure that this will work. Say, like if your previous AE13 worked at 1 to 100, then you test one slide before you make up your lot-to-lot validation, and test your one slide. Your one slide will be positive, then make up your antibody and do the lot-to-lot validation. That's a whole lot easier than going back and trying to figure out how much to take out of that vial, which is not easy, and how much antibody to add if you have to change this. Now, the parallel testing, we pull the controls that are needed. Say, like if you have a CD45, you want 2 control slides, one for the old lot number, one for the new lot number. You pull your old lot that you have from the refrigerator. You want to label your slides with the antibody old, and then your new you want to label with the new. Put your lot numbers on both of those slides so that you make sure that they do stain identical, and when you pull them out of the file, you have this information right on your slide. And I do save the slides. I save the paperwork that can be printed out too. Antibody validation for newly introduced antibodies. Staining condition must be evaluated in cases expected to be positive and negative for the antigen of interest. Now, a series of sufficient size may be run to give the pathologist an idea of the sensitivity and specificity of this particular antibody. Some antibodies, CAP, requires 10 positive and 10 negative cases. This means a slide that you're running a positive and negative on each of this. So you're looking at 40 slides. Some antibodies require 20 positive and 20 negative. This is, let's see, 80 slides. If you change the enzyme or the epitope retrieval in any way, you have to stain 2 positive and 2 negative cases. Now, if you are CAP certified or CLIA certified, you want to check with their regulations every year so that you stay in compliance with this, because they do change, and sometimes it's very, very difficult to keep up with this change. It is very, very important to for the antibodies with little available data to find out what the results can be. Now, CAP in the AMP 22750 says the laboratory has records of validation of new antibodies. Also, the majority of automation requires parallel testing, but there are instruments that don't allow for parallel testing, and CAP does state that sequential testing is acceptable for those particular antibodies. The parallel testing is very easy and on some instruments, and we do use the bond. I am not saying telling everybody to use the bond, but it works very well with our workload and everything. But if you would like protocols on this, please email me and I can send you a protocol. Now, an exception to the number of slides that you have to test can be ALK, because there's so few ALK positive cases that you would have a hard time getting 10 positives and 10 negatives. Our pathologists and the techs do work together very well, and the pathologists do record the results of this, and they look at the slides. They explain when problems happen, and they also watch for fluctuations. Now, I mentioned earlier about a low expressor, and certain antibodies we do run low expressor level controls, and one of those is cyclin D1 or BCL1 for mantle cell lymphoma. And in the top left, you can see where the antibody is very, very deeply stained. It's an overexpression of the BCL1 in the mantle cell lymphoma, and also a slide of tonsil that's used as a low expressor. Now, when I mentioned the new shipment, you want to double check to see if everything is the same lot number, and we like to label the top of our reagent vials, so when you open the refrigerator, you can quickly see where everything is. But it is very, very important to keep track of these lot numbers when you receive them and the expiration date. And our particular equipment, we're able to print out the lot-to-lot or shipment-to-shipment parallel testing. And if you want to look at the very, very top right of the page, you can see the instrument they're ran on. And then I use this information also to watch for variations in staining. And I like when the tech who puts these on does put their initials on the paper so that I can give them credit for doing this, and then it's mentioned in their evaluations. And I keep this information on a spreadsheet too. And when you also have to answer to CAP, how do you know these people are competent? This helps you to know that Susie and Johnny and Mary all did they did a lot of lot-to-lot shipment-to-shipment validations. And so you know that they are very, very competent in doing this. I'm going to also, the detection systems have to be parallel tested. So when you get in a new, whether it's a brown kit or a red kit, or whether you're looking at a link such as FITSI for your in situ hybridization, you must do parallel testing. And I've when I've given these talks at various places, I've had a number of people say, well, we test our antibodies, but we never thought to test our detection systems. You do have to test every part of your system. Now, we also use this paperwork for controls so that we have a record that this control was tested. And if you make your labels right for the paperwork, you can also see your the concentration of your antibody, your pretreatment, and your test protocol. Now, I'm sure that most immunohistochemistry systems, you're able to do this, but this is how we manage this on using the system we have. Also, I keep a spreadsheet from the very, very beginning of when we had to keep documentation on our parallel testing. Put in the antibody, where the antibody's from, the catalog number, whether it's clonal or polyclonal, the lot numbers, the expiration dates, and so on, and also the text initials, so that this spreadsheet is way huge now. It is 30+ pages at least. Now, CAP also under AMP 22760 says that a new reagent lot confirmation of acceptability, new lots of antibody and detection systems, you must test these with your old, and you have to have a written procedure, and you have to prove that you're really doing this. Now let's look at some staining patterns. This is cytokeratin 5 that's staining in normal cells, and you can see that it's really, really localized to the surface keratin and in certain glands. And this is an example of what we all need to do when we get a new antibody. This is a case of a mesothelioma, and you can see with the enzyme 1 for 10 minutes, there is absolutely no staining. With the citrate for 20 minutes, you have moderate staining, but with the EDTA for 20 minutes, you have excellent staining. Now, cytokeratin 7 in normal cells, it is very, very nice, but let's look at it when we test it on some tissues. CK7 on prostate, if you use an enzyme, there's absolutely no staining. The prostate stained with the CK7 with citrate for 20 minutes, you can see the staining is coming up, but not so detailed. With EDTA for 20 minutes, the staining is much better. And these are reasons why you want to test more than one avenue to make sure that it's going to work. But if you're looking at CK-MNF116, it works much better with the enzyme. And the enzyme 1 for 10 minutes on skin really, really highlights the skin. It does not look so good with the citrate or the EDTA. Now, some of the things to keep in mind too, just because you've done everything really, really good, there can be cases that appear to be overstaining. You want to check the fixation times. You want to check your processor to make sure everything was optimal, make sure that the tissue was put on the right processor. And occasionally we have to go back and look at everything, and we want to check the pretreatment, the heat-induced epitope retrieval, the enzyme-induced epitope retrieval, or maybe no retrieval is going to work the best. So sometimes we get very frustrated and say, gee whiz, I've done everything. What else could there be? Maybe we just need a new antibody. And we had a case of an adenocarcinoma of a lung, and it should be positive for CK7 and TTF1, but it should also be negative for calretinin. And if you look at the slides that I'm showing you, it was a nice H&E, mesothelioma. TTF1 was very positive. The CK7 was positive. And the calretinin was very, very positive. After we did a lot of additional testing, we tried no retrieval, and we tried citrate, and we tried EDTA for a variety of minutes, and the tumor stayed positive. We purchased a new antibody, and a new antibody from a different vendor. This is not vendor specific, but it was from a different vendor, and the tissue was negative. Now I'm going to show you a picture of the ERG antibody for angiosarcoma, and this stains very, very nicely. On the left you see an H&E, and on the right you see the ERG, but instead of seeing what you might think it's going to be just vascular, it shows wherever the antigen is. And this is what I mean by saying learn your patterns of staining, because that's very, very, very critical. The AE13, the control is on the right and the patient is on the left. This is 1 to 100, ER2 for 20 minutes. And you notice the signal to noise where you see the spaces where you just see nuclei, you don't see brown staining. You want to have that type of staining. And even the fat layers in the specimen on the left are not staining. And this is the antibody STAT6 for solitary fibrous tumors, and we use this at 1 to 200 with EDTA for 20 minutes. And again, you can see very delicate nuclear staining, very delicate nuclear staining in clear areas. It is not all brown. One of the things that we did when we set up and validated our testing about 8 years ago is we chose to move the H2O2 step to remove the endogenous peroxidase to the step right before the chromogen or the DAB. And this has helped with shorter incubation times. Now, you do have to validate all your antibodies using this protocol. So you just can't change tomorrow and start doing this, but you do have to validate every one of your antibodies to make sure they're going to work. But we did choose this, and we do get better staining on all of our antibodies with shorter incubation times and better staining. And this is an example of a record log that I keep when I get in a lot number of a detection system. And what lot number is that compared against, and who did perform the test. As a supervisor, I look at the slides, and then the pathologist looks at them, and I also keep track of what instrument that they are ran on, just to make sure that I can watch for fluctuations in the equipment. The instrumentation is very, very important to all of us. If you are staining multiple antibodies on a slide, each one has to be tested individually before they are combined in vials or before they can be used in any type of combination. And this is just a reminder to always test each one. And if you're buying RTUs, you can't just put all of those RTUs in one vial and expect this to work, because your diluent is going to be too, you're going to have too much diluent and not enough antibody. So you do have to have concentrates for your example here, CK5, CK14, P6, P3. Now, also, if you're working with decal material, you do need a disclaimer unless you have validated your testing. Now, here's an example of a pediatric bone marrow was fixed for 1 hour and decaled in HCl, and they needed a in situ hybridization, and the HCl did so much damage to the specimen that this biopsy had to be repeated. which is not what any of us want to ever have happen on a pediatric case. But we do take time with our bone marrows. They are fixed for 8 hours, and then they're decaled in Pharmacal 4 after the 8 hours fixation, and they're washed very well, and we do have optimal results with this procedure. We have 3 hematopathologists here and a lot of hemopath cases. Now, if you are doing immunohistochemistry and ISH for predictive information, the laboratory at least annually compares its patient results with published benchmarks, and the pathologists do need to keep track of this information. To help when I get inspected, I like to put on my index where the cap numbers are, which pages they're located on, and this is just an example of one page. And also, it can be very difficult to keep track of when and to find when this detection system or when this antibody was validated. So this is just an easy way for me to be able to find when was P40 validated, when was IDH1 validated, and use little markers. The equipment, when your new equipment comes in, it needs to be set up preferably by the company to make sure everything is calibrated properly. There's been no screws loose or anything that could have happened in shipment, and you want to stain a number of slides to make sure all the calibrations are correct. Each of the slots are staining properly, and you want to verify following any PMs or repairs to make sure that nothing has gotten out of kilter. And biannually, on the same day, tissue cut from the same block needs to be validated on each instrument. And this is a rule that has been going on in chemistry and a lot of other labs, but it is finally in IHC. And so for several years now, we compare all of our instruments biannually. We choose one antibody, and such as CD45, on the same day, tonsil cut from the same block, stain one slide minimum on each instrument, and compare the results. And if you move your instrument across the floor, you want to make sure that the floors are not uneven, there's no damage to the equipment, the XYZ axis could need to be recalibrated, but it needs to be tested just to make sure that there's no unevenness of staining or everything is level. Now, I do keep all of the slides year to year, and whether they're tested because of control purposes or tested for parallel testing, this is just an example of how I keep them. And I've been told that we need to keep these slides for a minimum of 10 years. Now, if you ever get a message or a letter from a company and say that something's under medical device recall, that cannot be used for a diagnosis. And it could be that they had a complaint. There's nothing wrong with what you have on the shelf, but it still can't be used until everything is clear. So always be on the lookout. These regulations are for the good of the patient. In the parallel testing, we've identified manufacturing issues. No chromogen in a vial, vials labeled with one thing, but it was really another antibody and not a probe at all. Weak reagents. Reagents can be contaminated. Anytime you find something out of ordinary, notify the vendor immediately. There's no perfect anything. Today's world, we have lots of variances. It could be that something happened, something froze in shipment, maybe it overheated, maybe it sat on the dock in the sun, and we just need to keep ahead of all of these things. So don't get angry at the vendor and don't get angry at your coworkers. Notify the vendor and let them worry about what and how. They just need to, send you a new item. This is what happened when some of the vials were dry in a system. There's absolutely no staining on the one that was parallel tested. Now, I don't have all the answers, but I've been working with immunohistochemistry since 1976, and one of the things that I learned a long time ago is change is the normal. Always be vigilant of the staining patterns. Always consider your pre-analytic, your analytic, and your post-analytic conditions, and your warm and cold ischemia. They play a big role in your preservation of the antigens and the DNA and the RNA that we are looking at. The fixation and the processing, the pretreatment, the titers, the detection systems, the equipment that we use, the instrumentation we use, and make it your goal to stay ahead of the inspectors. Always ask for recommendations. If you're challenged, you want to definitely ask for recommendations. Well, how would you handle this? That shows that you care and you want the best for your patients, the best for your lab, the best for everything. And a few references are included on this page. And if you want to really know and learn a lot more, take the training if you're a CAP certified lab and to be a CAP inspector. This, even though it doesn't deal directly with histology and immunohistochemistry items, it still really vastly increases your knowledge of what you may need to know and how things are in the other phases of the laboratory too.